Good afternoon. At first place, I would like to express my vivid thanks to the organizers, especially Elena, Alison, Anne, and David. And at second place, please accept the ritual apologies of French people when they start to speak in English. I did a rehearsal to articulate properly, but I know it's going to be difficult for you and for me, but I won't be long. So, before to start, I would like to say that this workshop in Trinidad proves the efficiency of the Diasporic Archives Network, and for me means also the discovery of the importance of the Caribbean culture. So I'm going to give you, for about 15 minutes, some information on the subject of this panel, the politics of collecting, distributed in 3 moments. First, the situation in France. Second and third, how things proceed in Germany and in the Netherlands. Eventually, I will present some relatively new elements which affect the European archiving landscape, and I think these new elements will be commented by the next speaker, Kevin Repp. But first of all, I would like to stress one crucial point. Most of the institutions which will be mentioned are not competing to acquire papers when they are in auctions or when they are declared available by their owners. In the immense majority of cases, these institutions are cooperating in order to find the best option to preserve and give an access to documents. Maybe, or maybe not, the general lack of money makes things easier. People are more flexible. So first point, what are the politics of collecting literary papers in France? There are 4 collectors. In the alphabetical order, there is first the Archives Nationales, National Public Record Office, and considering the very domain we are interested in, literary papers, these are collected for their large part in a section called Archives Privées in the central office, but also through the numerous Archives Départementales, county archives. We can also note some series of literary documents in the Archives du Monde du Travail, Department of Public Record, specialized in the work corporate bodies papers, which houses the archive of the Bibliothèque des Chemins de Fer railway collection, a famous literary collection from Hachette at the second half of the 19th century. In the public records, all disciplines and periods are represented. In some occasions, papers are bought with limited means for the county archives, but the general rule is donation. In second place, we find the Bibliothèque littéraire Jacques Doucet, located in Paris, which is under the authority of the Chancellerie des Universités, Ministry of Education, unlike the public records or the National Library of France, which are under the Ministry of Culture. The collection, which was primarily built by Jacques Doucet, is specialized in 20th century French literature. It has grown in a very significant way through donations and auctions, during which Doucet can ask for preemption. Then the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which holds the biggest collections of literary manuscripts through its Département des Manuscrits. This collection, of course, has no limitation in time and more in literary genre. The BNF benefits from several donations and has also an active range of politics of acquisitions, including sponsoring. Among the most spectacular and recent ones, I will cite Guy Debord's papers, Memoirs of Casanova, and Michel Foucault archives for several million euros each. The BNF has obviously the right of preemption and can also declare a collection as a trésor national, which postpone the sale for 3 years, which is supposed to be the needed time to raise funds. The last actor is IMEC, Institut Mémoire de l'Édition Contemporaine. I won't be long. I already had the opportunity to introduce the place where I'm working in, which is Institute of Contemporary Publishing, whose collection combine publishers' papers and contemporary French writers' ones, focused on 1920-1990. The politics of collecting are ruled by the will to build a close net of documents which echo one to another. Authors can be novelists, poets, essayists, but also artists, psychoanalysts, and translators. In this last case, we have gathered papers of the most important translators, such as Maurice Edgar Coindreau, Armel Guerne, Andre Derval, Henri Méchonic, or Gilles Barbedette. These papers, with those of publishers and literary agents, are particularly important for a better understanding of circulation of text. IMEC, for years, has established a relationship with owners of documents based upon a deposit agreement. This possibility is nowadays offered by the BNF as well. For the last 10 years, IMEC gives preferential treatment to donations, directly to the Institute or through a foundation which has been created for that purpose, especially useful when the inheritors expect heavy taxes. Let's have a brief look now at how the literary archives are collected in Germany. I recently interviewed Marcel Lepper, Vice Director of the DLA, who gave me the following information. Superseding the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin or the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek in Leipzig and Frankfurt, the two major literary collections are the Akademie der Künstler, Artist Academy in Berlin, and the Deutsches Literaturarchiv in Marbach am Neckar, close to Stuttgart in South Germany. They both are under the authority of the Ministry of Culture, Cultural Affairs. And in the case of the DLA, they can also benefit from credits from the Ministry of Research for acquisitions. The two institutions have both the main part of their collections. The papers of the Surkamp Publishing House reach apparently a jolly amount of money. I asked Marcel Lepper if the German Record Office was having literary papers as well, and yes, in some occasions when the works have been written by somebody working as a civil servant. I also asked about the translators' papers, and the DLA policy is to collect these papers when the producer is primarily known as a writer, but notable exception like Elmar Topoven, who was the Beckett's translator. Regarding the situation in the Netherlands, according to Hoort Meinders, whom I had on the phone last week, director of the Letterkundig, the main institutions are the university libraries, archives from Middle Age to the 18th century. Then the University of Amsterdam and Leiden for the 19th century, and the letterkundig for the contemporary domain. The collecting is mainly done through donations. Something like 2% has been done through financial acquisitions, and there is also some entries through what we can call permanent loans. The letterkundig collection, which does not hold translator papers, is notably strong for the interwar period. Last part of my exposé. In the last 8 years or so, the situation of archives collecting and management in Northern Europe has experienced some telling changes. A new operator who, in some aspects, is acting like some art galleries did 50 years ago, is trying hard to create a new market on autographs through a deep destabilization of the values of patrimonial, historic, or so-called prestigious literary documents. Even if the financial service warned the possible clients, and even if the press on several occasions has published reports which reveal the underlying commercial mechanism, this operator is getting more and more influential, sponsors sometimes some institutions, and succeeds to attract more and more clients. He promises a return of 8% for investment on manuscripts, given that it is always a shared investment with several other investors. Any reasonable person can imagine that the future of this Musée des Manuscrits et des Lettres would end in a huge scandal. But for the moment, all the regular archives collectors have often the impression that some rules have changed without any warning, and that a kind of double language is used for some hidden reasons. Fortunately, and thanks to networks like the Diasporic Archives One, more and more collectors can have precise talks on this subject and adopt the relevant means. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. I'm now going to invite Kevin Repp to respond to the two talks that we've just heard and to offer some observations from his perspective as the curator of European manuscripts at the Beinecke.
Good afternoon. Well, first of all, just let me say I would like to add to what Andre and many other people at the conference have said about the marvelous possibility for dialogue that we have here through the Diasporic Diasporic Archives Network, and thanks to the Leverhulme Foundation for providing that possibility. It really is collection development, collecting, where things end up. The politics of that is really the outcome of a lot of dialogue, constant dialogue, and it's constantly changing. And one of the things that's really fascinating about being in the position that I'm in at Beinecke is to see how Beinecke, through its collection development policy, has actually done a lot to shape attitudes and sensibilities about collection development in Europe. Two archives, one mentioned by each of the two previous panelists here, are front and center in the Beinecke's history. The first one being the archive of Marinetti, which is a very complicated story. Why didn't the rest of the archive come? A lot of that has to do with the way that that archive ended up coming to Beinecke, and I can talk more about that later, but the upshot of it is that as a result of that transaction, the Italian government and Italian institutions became very keenly aware of the possibility of losing collections of that sort, so that when it came time for the second and third rounds of the archive to be sold, Beinecke was no longer willing to become involved in those negotiations because of that. So that's a really good example of the kind of back and forth negotiating that goes on, and the outcomes are not always bad ones, I think. The other one is the Guy Debord archive, which was mentioned by Andre in his talk. That is an archive that I personally was involved in trying to obtain for Beinecke, and that archive was blocked by the French government and is now at the Bibliothèque Nationale. Again, a very interesting experience for me, and one I'd be happy to talk more about. I don't want to carry on for too long about that, but I do want to say that for me, the outcome of that is a great success story, in that when I first encountered the Debord archive, it was in the process of being sold off piece by the widow, and I immediately made an attempt to contact her and to make an appeal to her that this was not the proper way to do the best service to the memory of Guy Debord or to indeed her own personal interests, and made an appeal for her to keep the archive together. Several years of negotiations followed that, and we were successful in keeping the archive together. It's just at the Bibliothèque Nationale, not at Beinecke. For me, that's fine. Anytime, and I've said this before, I think, to this group, anytime another institution wants to buy an archive or to acquire an archive, that's one less archive that I don't have to worry about. Because, when I said dialogue earlier, I mean, really, the reality of how collections are built and how particular archives end up in particular places where sometimes it seems quite mysterious is really a dialogue like the dialogue you would have on the floor of the stock exchange at Wall Street. So you've got, imagine a group, you've all seen, no doubt, film footage of Wall Street where you have all of these people screaming and yelling and trying to get the attention of other people in the room. That's exactly what it's like. That is the reality of the world in which manuscripts and the fate of manuscripts is decided. That group of people are not stockbrokers and bankers, but they are a whole host of people, some of whom were mentioned earlier, professionals such as ourselves, certainly librarians, archivists, preservation librarians, I would also add to that mix, as well as curators, are one voice in that multitude. But in addition to that, there are private collectors. Private collectors are really a very powerful force in deciding what becomes of things, and indeed in the creation of archives in many cases themselves. In addition to that, you have the creators of the archives, you have the families of the creators of the archives, you have scholars who have a particular interest, you have fan bases, you have then finally, ultimately on some occasions, such as the Debord situation and the Marinetti papers, you have politicians who become involved. So all of these people are talking to each other, and they're not always talking in a very calm voice. What they're talking about is what I think this Diasporic Archives Network is really about, which is archives. It's about archives. It's about archives that are in peril, and I have my own particular view on this. Thousands and tens of thousands of archives are the subject of the screaming and hollering in this room full of people who are having a dialogue and trying to decide, as Andre said, not really competing against each other so much as trying to figure out where is the best place for something to end up and how can we make this happen. I just want to give one example of that, which has confronted me recently, and in the course of the last few days has been on my mind quite a lot, and that's the example of the Ousmane Sembène archive. Ousmane Sembène is a Senegalese, was a Senegalese filmmaker. It's called the father of African cinema. His papers are currently sitting in well, maybe they're not there anymore, but they're in a penthouse on 55th Avenue in New York City in Midtown, if you can imagine this. I recently had a chance, after many, many years, to go look at these papers to decide what Beinecke ought to do about them, and I'd really be interested to hear the opinions of this group about that, because it's a very instructive story. It's the story of a scholar at Mount Holyoke who has devoted his career to studying Sembène and was very closely, personally friends with him, who has been trying for many years to find a home for this archive. In the process of that attempt, Sembène himself died, and then his family started to quarrel amongst themselves about what to do with the papers. I want to emphasize here that the interest on the part of the family had nothing at all to do with the value of the papers in a cultural sense. They were purely interested in its monetary value, and that continues to be the case. Meanwhile, between the first time I heard about the situation and today, about 7 years have passed. In those 7 years, that archive was stuffed into plastic bags and sitting out, sitting in a courtyard exposed to the elements. So by the time the archive came to us, all of the stories that we've heard here before apply in this case. So Beinecke is one of many institutions that was approached as a place that might be able to provide a home for this archive. And where the situation stands now is that when we went to this penthouse apartment on 55th Avenue between 5th and 6th Street, so right in the middle of Manhattan, really penthouse in the sky, was as soon as the doors open, you could literally smell, I mean, there's mold, there's, you know, all of the things, that infestation, all these different problems. So we're in a penthouse in New York with rubber gloves and masks on, looking at this material, trying to determine what the cost of acquiring this archive would be to us. In the process of that, it was determined that every single page, and the archive is not well ordered, every single page would have to be HVAC'd on both sides. First it would have to be deep frozen, then that would have to happen, and then there would be a variety of treatments to deal with the other issues involved. So the magnitude of the challenges that we're all facing here is something that is overwhelming to me at times. But the question to me is, after listening to the very wide range of passionate opinions about a subject like this, is would Beinecke be a hero or would Beinecke be a villain if it decided to try to save this archive from destruction? That's just one example. It's one that's a bit out of the area that I usually collect in. I collect post-war avant-garde and counterculture, which is an area that is not currently being collected in many institutions, certainly not in the home countries. And there again, though, I feel the same sense of urgency. I haven't encountered anything quite as extreme as the Sembène papers, but I certainly have encountered things that are beyond saving at this point. And you just have a feeling that, really, I have the feeling that it's my mission to make sure that this very important part of our cultural heritage does not disappear from the earth. And the fact that the papers then end up at Beinecke is something that I often, you know, with Italians and with French people and Germans, I've had many conversations about that. And the opinions range really quite wildly on that. But for the most part, the people who share my goal of trying to protect that heritage are just simply delighted that any place is interested in it. And a place like Beinecke, when it becomes interested, has its own, people have called it the Beinecke effect. When I started collecting in the area that I collect in, nobody cared about it. And then we purchased the papers of Maurice Lemaitre, one of the founders of the lettrist movement. And after that, all of a sudden, lettrism became something that other places were interested in. And I feel really good about that. I don't feel like that's a bad thing. But again, this is just my own perspective. So basically, the silly title of negotiating boundaries is not Andre's fault. That's my fault. That was the title that I picked because I feel like it describes very well what we've been doing here. I was going to go on and talk a bit about U.S. Attitudes towards this whole situation and the way in which diasporic archives ended up in America, but I think that we would like to leave some time for questions. So thank you.